welcome everyone to our fourth and final session of the series, The Promise and Peril of Citizenship, Jewish Paths to Belonging. This week, we will consider the impact of the establishment of the State of Israel and the shift toward Jewish political sovereignty. As a reminder, if you missed any of our prior three sessions, recordings are available on our website, and the chat will be open for questions. So with that, I now welcome Dr. Gudefin to join us. Welcome.
Thank you, Matt, for your warm welcome. Hello, everyone. For those who are joining us for the first time, for this final session, welcome. And for those who joined us for earlier sessions, thank you for tuning in again. So far, we covered a lot of ground. In the first session, we talked about the concept of legal emancipation in Western Europe. For the second session, we moved to the Russian and Ottoman Empire. And then last time, we talked about colonial Algeria. So today, for this final session, I want to talk about Israel and what the shift to political sovereignty means for Jewish rights. And in many ways, this is an ongoing story, and I think you'll see this throughout the presentation that we have not reached the end of history. History is still writing itself. So there are many questions I think we'll grapple in this final session that probably you will be left grappling with for the foreseeable future. And one way I thought I would approach the question of Jewish rights post-1948, post the creation of Israel, was the notion of return. And I'm particularly interested in its multiple meanings and how fraught this concept can be. So, of course, the concept of return is really a founding narrative of the creation of the State of Israel, the idea of Jews returning to their ancestral homeland, the idea of Jewish self-determination, and the term in Hebrew that I think is really central to the origin stories of the State of Israel is the concept of kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. And I want to show different aspects of that concept and how people have grappled with this in recent decades. What also I find really interesting about the concept of return in the concept of post-1948 is that there's both a legal component to it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the law of return, but there's also an emotional component to it, right? This idea of return, it's something that I think that is rooted in everyone's psyche. Wherever you're from, there's always an idea that you're returning to something, however defined, right? And so I'm really interested in this interplay between the law and the emotional, and that goes back to what we're discussed in earlier sessions about the concept of belonging. And I think a related concept is also the concept of home, right? The idea of return in the context of Israel is this idea of going back to one's home. But what does home mean, and what does it mean to return home? I think is something that many of us are both within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community are still grappling with. So through the concept of return, we're going to really look at kind of the process through which the early Israeli state really drew the boundaries of belonging, both for Jews and non-Jews. And then one final introductory remark. The reason I'm also interested in the concept of return is that it really inscribes a temporality into the concept of citizenship. So in the previous sessions, when we talked about citizenship, we spent a lot of time looking at how Jews in various places, Jewish individuals, articulated visions for the future and how these visions often conflicted with each other's. And looking at the concept of return, I think also makes us realize that citizenship is not only about the present and the future, but it's also about the past. How do we relate to the past, and what stories do we tell ourselves about who we are as individuals and collectives? And how does that shape how we define rights? So those are really kind of the main ideas with which I'm approaching this question today. So let me start sliding my slides. You know, I love slides and I love primary sources, so we'll have a lot of them today also. So I wanted to start with this photograph by an Israeli artist. It's actually a self-portrait. It's called 9 out of 400, Erasing Mizrahi history. So he's erasing Middle Eastern Jewish history. And what he's showing here on this photograph is a textbook that was used in Jewish schools in Israel in the 1970s when he was growing up. And it shows he's holding the only pages in the whole entire textbook devoted to the history of Mizrahi Jews, so Jews from Arab lands and from the Middle East. And what he's really trying to get at here is this idea that Mizrahi Jews have not been fully part, and that was especially true in the 70s. I think less so today, but there are, I think, to some degree, ongoing tensions that Mizrahi Jews have been erased from kind of Israeli institutional histories. And so we'll look at return from different angles today, but one of them is specifically the history of non-Ashkenazi Jews, non-European Jews in Israel and how they complicate the notion of return. Okay, so let's start in 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel itself. So the state, as you know, was established in 1948. We have this actually really amazing document called the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel that really sets out the vision for this new state. And so I brought excerpts from the declaration. So Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books, the Torah. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people remained faithful to it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. So here you have really key elements of really the fundamental values and vision of the founders of the State of Israel, right? The idea that this is the land that gave rise to the Jewish people. It's the birthplace of the Jewish people. And this is where Jews developed their culture, a culture that exists to this day, and especially the biblical heritage. And it's really articulating the notion of return in the Declaration of Independence. So one note here, and I'm sure everyone knows this, the founders of the State of Israel, by and large, even all of them really, were Ashkenazi Jews who were secular minded. So when they talked about, the cultural values and the Torah, it was really from a secularized perspective, right? So they really understood that monotheism and the Torah, and especially the prophetic text, were very much part of the heritage of the Jewish people, and that this cultural heritage had universal significance. And so that's very much the framework through which they understood the founding of the State of Israel. And they didn't want to create a theocratic state. They wanted a secular state that would remain true to this cultural heritage, but would also respect, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, not only for Jews, but also for non-Jews, because of course, they were people who lived in that land before the founding of Israel, were Christians or Muslims, were not Jewish. And there were also Jewish individuals, of course, the Yishuv, they had been Jews always in the land of Israel. But there was this understanding that even though we are really articulating Jewish self-determination, this is a state that will be respectful of religious and ethnic differences. So I'm reading here further from the Declaration of Independence. Okay, the catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of homelessness by reestablishing in Eretz Israel the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations, in their own sovereign state. So here, of course, it's acknowledging the proximity of the Holocaust. By 1948, 1/3 of the Jewish people had been killed. It's a catastrophe of immense scope and significance. And according to the founders, the Shoah was really proof that Jews had been homeless and that they needed a home of their own. And here the notion that Jews should be masters of their own fate really echoes what we've seen in previous sessions, especially when we talked about the tract auto emancipation by Pensker and other writers in the 1880s and beyond, right? So it's really echoing kind of an older political tradition, this idea that Jews should have their own land and their own territory. And it's articulating it very explicitly that Jews should be really like any other nation in the sense that they should have their own state. So it further says, the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for ingathering of the exiles, the kibbutz galuyot. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, and sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions, and it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Okay, so this really paved the way for the Law of Return, which was enacted 2 years later, right? So the founding document of Israel claims that this is a home for Jews and Jews will be able to come. And so what the Law of Return did is that it really set out the legal framework through which this return would be made possible. So according to this text, according to the Law of Return, every Jew has the right to come to this country as an ole. It also says that the Minister of Immigration is charged with the implementation of this law and make regulation as to any matter relating to such implementation. Right. So we're not going to read the whole law, but if you read all of it, at no point does the law really defines who is a Jew. And that actually triggered multiple decades of wrangling, controversy, political crisis between different ministries, between different political parties in Israel over who actually qualifies under the Law of Return. So this is really one aspect of the story that I want to explore together, right? So when we say Jews have the right of return, who actually qualifies under that law? Before we look at the controversy surrounding the definition of who is a Jew under the Law of Return, or the lack of definition, I also want to mention really a tension that we're still living with today, and it affects Jews in Israel, but I think in many ways also Jews in the diaspora, which is the tension between the democratic ideals that are spelled out in the Declaration of Independence and the role of religion in the Israeli state. Because really the only way that that David Ben-Gurion and his political party were able to rule from the early days of the state of Israel is that even before 1948, they actually came to an agreement with Orthodox parties over the role that religion would have in the future state of Israel. So I think already in 1947, there was an agreement. It was the status quo between David Ben-Gurion and Orthodox parties. And what this argument really rested on was the idea that Jewish law, to some degree, would still have a role to play in the state of Israel. And really the place where this became most important and visible was jurisdiction over marriage and divorce. And so in 1953, so 3 years after the Law of Return, the Rabbinical Court's jurisdiction law was enacted. And what this pretty much, what this did is that it gave the rabbinate in Israel, and the rabbinate historically and to this day is an Orthodox institution that does not represent kind of internal dominational pluralism within Judaism. So the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel has monopoly over personal status, especially marriage and divorce. So there is no civil marriage in Israel, and non-Jewish individuals are ruled by the law of their own confession. And this has actually roots to Ottoman law, pre-State of Israel. And this was something that was preserved by British authorities, right? So from the beginning, you see this tension where it's a state funded by secular Jews who really have very much a secular vision of the state in mind, but they made room for kind of for religious law, especially in the sphere of marriage, due to kind of political considerations. And you can imagine that for the rabbinate, the definition of who is a Jew is very straightforward. It's an halachic definition. It's a definition rooted in traditional Jewish law. And this definition really provides two ways of being Jewish. The first one is you have a Jewish mother. The second one is that even if you didn't have if you weren't born of a Jewish mother, you converted in the Orthodox way, right? So those are the two only ways to be Jewish according to a traditional rabbinical law. But the question that arose fairly early on in the state of Israel is that a lot of people who wanted to move to Israel and settled in Israel did not abide by an halachic definition of Israel. They had different understanding of what it meant to be Israeli or to be Jewish specifically. So one of the questions that came up 10 years after the creation of the state of Israel was the question of the population registry, because Israel established a population registry and anyone who migrated to Israel had to register themselves. And according to this early population registry, they had to register both their religion and their nationality. And that's really where the problem arose, because there were multiple individuals who wanted to be registered as under the Jewish nationality, but under either no religion or under a different religion. And I'll explore this issue further in a little bit. And this came out specifically in cases when parents were within mixed unions. So for instance, specifically, the father was Jewish and the mother was not. So halachically, according to a traditional definition of Jewish, the child was not Jewish. However, in multiple cases, parents wanted to register their kids in the population registry as Jewish by nationality or nationhood, but not by religion, because by religion they were not Jewish or they didn't see themselves as Jewish. So the Minister of the Interior in 1958 enacted a law that argued that anyone who self-identifies as Jewish, who wants to register themselves as Jewish in the population registry, could do so, because the population registry serves, secular purposes. It doesn't have a religious function, and in a secular state, it shouldn't define what Jewish mean, or it shouldn't impose a religious definition of Judaism. But that triggered that decision to allow anyone who self-identified as Jewish to register under Jewish nationality really created a political crisis in Israel. And that led Ben-Gurion to issue this remarkable letter to 50 sages of Israel, so 50 political thinkers of various kind of spheres of profession and background. He wrote this letter to these sages, both in Israel and in the diaspora, asking them what should be done. So here I'm reading a letter an excerpt from the letter that he sent to these 50 sages. The question has arisen of how to register the religion and nationhood of the children of mixed marriages when the father is Jewish and the mother is not Jewish and has not converted, but both agree to have the child registered as a Jew. Some contend that as it is a civil registry that does not serve for religious purposes, there is no cause to adopt religious criteria for the registry. Others maintain that since religion and nationhood cannot be separated, and since religious affiliation is by its very nature a religious issue, religious criteria should indeed be used for registering both nationhood and religion. So 4 considerations must be noted. The first one is the principle of freedom of conscience and religion, which we've seen in the founding document of the State of Israel. Second, the idea that Israel serves today as the center of the ingathering of the exiles. So by 58, there was this sense that this really is where the future of most of world's Jewry lay. And so we have to take that into account, that we need to find a definition of Jewish that will be inclusive, given the fact that people will come from many different countries and with many different religious tradition and spectrum of religious observance. It also states that the Jewish community in Israel is unlike the Jewish community in the diaspora. And here, what Ben-Gurion really alluded to was the fact that there was a need for stringency in the diaspora because Jews were a small minority. And so the impetus for assimilating, for really shedding one's particularism and Jewish identity was very strong in the diaspora because of the demographic circumstances of diaspora Jewry. But what he alluded to here is that maybe things could be a bit different in Israel because Jews are the majority in the state of Israel. So if there's a mixed couple, it is likely that even though halachically the child is not Jewish, they will be raised among Jews and they will be Jewish, right? So there's less of an incentive to have this kind of religious stringency that we have in the diaspora. But, and that's number 4 of his considerations, on the other hand, the Israeli nation does not see itself as separate from diaspora Jewry. So the idea here is that he also didn't want to enact laws that would be perceived very negatively by Jewish leadership outside of Israel. What's really interesting about this letter is first, as I mentioned, that it was sent not only by religious leaders in Israel, but religious leaders in the diaspora. So there was this idea of really seeking guidance from diaspora Jewry. And the other interesting aspect is that even though Orthodox Jews at that point were probably about 10% of world Jewry, 50% of the people who were consulted by Ben-Gurion on this issue were actually Orthodox themselves. So of course, the vast majority of the responses that he got was the idea that the only definition of who is Jewish should be an halachic definition, because any other definition or any competing definition of Jewish would create divisions, within Jewish communities and between Israel and the diaspora. Okay, so here I want to bring a case that's also connected to the mixed marriage case because it really tested the boundaries of who is Jewish. And this case is quite a well-known legal case that was heard by the Israeli Supreme Court in 1962. And this is a case named Rufeisen versus Minister of the Interior. And maybe people are not familiar with the name Rufeisen, but the name that they might be most familiar with is Brother Daniel. So Brother Daniel was this really fascinating figure. He was born into a Polish Jewish family. He was born Jewish. He was raised Jewish. He became a resistant actually during World War II. His own life was in danger as an ethnic Jew, of course, but he saved many people's life by virtue of his acts of resistance during World War II. And during the war, he converted to Catholicism. And then he lived in Poland for a few years. And in 1958, he describes that he had a burning desire to move to the state of Israel. And he wanted to make Aliyah. He moved to Israel. And he asked to be registered in the population registry that I mentioned previously as a Jew by nationality. But of course, by religion, he was not a Jew. He was a Catholic because he had converted. And so that created a very, very difficult case for judges in Israel and for political authorities and the various ministers involved in this complicated case about whether Brother Daniel was actually entitled to the law of return. And what is the definition of Jew? What does it mean if we were to grant him automatic right to citizenship? What does it mean about the definition of Jewish in the state of Israel? So I wanted to show you 2 conflicting responses to this dilemma. So let's start with the majority opinion. And also one thing to say at the outset, so the two opinions I'm going to show you are the opinions of Justices Moshe Silberg and Chaim Cohn. And what's really interesting, so the first one was from Lithuania and Cohn was from Germany. But what's really interesting is that these were individuals who had really a religious upbringing and were very conversant in Jewish law, in Jewish text. And we don't see this so much in the excerpts that I'm bringing you today, but they very much incorporated that kind of religious knowledge and learning into their opinions themselves. So I think when we think of Israel and we think of this division between, like Chiloni, like secular and religious, I think it distorts both the reality today and definitely the reality, at the outset of the state of Israel, where the division is not as stark as one might imagine. So let's look at Moshe Silberg's opinion. And so he was against giving Brother Daniel the right of return. But it's very clear in the opinion that he had a lot of respect for Brother Daniel, and he said, this is a heroic human who clearly really identifies with the Jewish people. But as justices in this new state, we really have to draw the boundaries of belonging. And would it be acceptable to have a Catholic, even though he's ethnic by birth, a Jew by birth, become an Israeli citizen under the law of return? So he wrote in his opinion, can he, Brother Daniel, be denying the burning desire of his life to be completely identified with the people which he loves and to become a citizen of the land of his dreams, not as a stranger coming from without, but as a Jew returning home? But this sense of profound sympathy and obligation must not be permitted to mislead us and to justify our profaning the concept of Jew, both in name and in meaning. I have reached the conclusion that what Brother Daniel is asking us to do is to erase the historical and sanctified significance of the term Jew and to deny all the spiritual values for which our people gave their lives in different periods of our long dispersion. To grant his request would dim the luster and darken the glory of the martyrs who sanctified the holy name in the Middle Ages beyond recognition. Our history would lose its broken continuity, and our people begin numbering its days from the emancipation which followed the French Revolution. A sacrifice such as this, no one is entitled to ask of us, even one so meritorious as the petitioner before this court. So here what I found really, really interesting is really this idea of going back to like the long durée, the long stretch of Jewish history, and really a desire to honor that history. And so what he's saying here, and it's a very European narrative actually, this idea that Jews throughout their history in Christian lands have been persecuted, have been murdered, have sacrificed their lives. Here is referring to, the Inquisition and the Crusades. I think specifically here is referring to the Crusades. So this notion that it would really tarnish the memory of people who died many centuries ago in the hands of Christians to give a Christian, albeit someone who was born Jewish, access to the law of return. So what I'm interested in this opinion is really the ways in which he's mobilizing history to reach this final opinion. Okay, so the other thing that Moshe Solberg really articulated in this text was the notion that the law of return is a secular law. Because as I said, halachically, Brother Daniel was Jewish. Someone who was born Jewish cannot convert out of Judaism. So even someone who adopts Catholicism or any religion remains a Jew for the purpose of rabbinical law. So according to a purely religious definition of the law of return, Brother Daniel should actually be entitled to automatic citizenship under Israeli law. But what Moshe Solberg declared is that this law is secular. So we're not going to adopt a religious definition. We must come up with a different definition. So we're left wondering on what basis should we articulate another definition? And so the standard that he sets in this text is that we must go with the ordinary persons or ordinary Jews' understanding of what Jewish mean, right? So we're not looking at specific texts or prior opinions. We're really looking at, if you ask any Israeli on the streets, what is a Jew? Would they think that a Catholic monk is a Jew? They wouldn't, right? So he writes, the term Jew must be interpreted in the sense that it is understood by Jews, for they are nearest to the subject matter on the law, and who better than they know the essential content of the term Jew? Once more, a question must be asked. What is the ordinary Jewish meaning of the term Jew, and does it include a Jew who has become a Christian? So the answer to this question is, in my opinion, sharp and clear. A Jew who has become a Christian is not deemed a Jew. There is one thing that is shared by all Jews who live in Israel, and that is we do not cut ourselves off from our historic past, nor deny our ancestral heritage. And so he said, here I'm skipping a bit. He's talking again about the martyrs and the fate of Jews in Christian Europe in the Middle Ages. again, alluding to the Crusades and to the Inquisition. He said, what can all this national sentiment mean to him, to Brother Daniel? Would he not see in a different light and appraised by other standards are draining to the dregs the bitter cup from which we drank so deeply in those dark Middle Ages? Right. So this was ultimately the prevailing opinion, and Brother Daniel was not able to make Aliyah under the law of return, but he was granted Israeli citizenship through a different route. So there is the possibility for non-Jewish individuals to migrate to Israel, but it's a different legal framework, and obviously much more difficult than through the route traced by the law of return. But what's really interesting here is, again, really the ways in which he ties the present, the state of Israel, to the longer history of the Jews. And so that's where the opinion of the other justice, the dissenting opinion of Chaim Cohn, becomes really interesting. Because Chaim Cohn starts with a similar promise that obviously this state is based on the long history of Jews, and that we care about that history, and that we have ongoing ties to what happened in the past. But he's reading of how should that shape the definition of Jew and the law of return is radically different from Zilberg's. So he writes in his dissenting opinion, I agree further with Silberg when he says that we do not cut ourselves off from our historic past, nor do we deny our ancestral heritage. But I cannot agree that in giving such an interpretation to the law of return, it is imperative or permissible to deprive the petitioner of his rights as a Jew. It is true that the history of our people throughout its dispersion is soaked with the innocent blood of thousands and tens of thousands of martyrs who were racked and tortured, slain and burned by the Catholic Church and its retinues for their fidelity to the God of Israel. So here is starting really from a similar promise that Jews have suffered greatly in the hands of Christians, and is mentioning the same events. Is mentioning the Crusades, the Inquisition, and even the Shoah. But then it comes to a very different conclusion. He says, Silberg is of the opinion that the historic continuity of the Jewish people from those terrible times till the present day can never permit us to regard anyone as a Jew who has entered into the covenant of the Catholic Church. But, he says, I myself do not postulate an historical continuity such as this. If history is continuous from the start and uninterrupted from the start, this does not mean that it does not change, progress, and evolve. On the contrary, changes of times and ideas and continuous improvement of ways of life and law, all these are in the very nature of the process of history. So here he's really saying, even though we must be loyal to our history, history by definition is change, right? So we can adopt a definition of Jewish that is much more inclusive than it would have been in the past, because history evolves. And here it really comes to his main idea, which is that this is a new time in the history of the Jewish people, because for the first time in 2,000 years, Jews have regained political sovereignty, right? So it's a completely different context than the context that diaspora Jewry inhabited. So he writes, never has there been such a revolutionary event in the history of the Jewish people, scattered and dispersed amongst the nations, as the establishment of the state of Israel. So here he says, in the diaspora, we're a minority, but in Israel, we're in our own state, in an independent nation. So we have created for ourselves in our own state the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations. And here is drawing on the Declaration of Independence that we read earlier. This revolution, so the revolution really of the creation of the State of Israel, is not merely of a political character. It renders imperative a revision of the values which have long imbibed in our long exile. Times have changed and the wheel has turned full circle. Should the State of Israel, and here again he's quoting from the Declaration of Independence, based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel, act towards its inhabitants and those who return, as did the evil rulers of some Catholic kingdoms in the past. So here he's really articulating the reasons why Brother Daniel should be able to make Aliyah under the law of return as a Jew, even though he's a Jew who changed religion, right? So his opinion didn't prevail, but it really shows you the different ways in which those really major figures in the legal sphere articulated what it meant to be Jewish, or what it would mean to be Jewish in a Jewish nation state. Okay, I don't want to draw too much on this, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that a mere few years after this case, there was yet another case that came to the attention of the Supreme Court, and this was again a question of, in the cases of a mixed marriage, can children of a Jewish father and not a non-Jewish mother be registered as Jewish inhabitants by nationality? And so this was a very famous case called the Benjamin Shalit case. And so interesting. So what triggered the Supreme Court case is the Ministry of the Interior's refusal to register Benjamin Shalit's daughter as Jewish by nationality, but not by religion. And again, that raised the question of who counts as a Jew, and is Jewishness a religion, a nationality, both, or even something else? And fascinatingly, the Supreme Court actually sided with Shalit. They argued that she could register as a Jew by nationality, even though she was not a Jew by religion. But that once again triggered a political crisis, which ultimately forced a legal compromise, which led to an amendment to the law of return. And so this amendment was enacted 2 years after the Shalit case in 1970. And what's really interesting is, I think to this day, many people within the diaspora, and I think in Israel itself, think that the law of return is based on the Nazi definition of who is a Jew. So there's this understanding that grandchildren of Jews, even though they might not be religiously, or according to Orthodox law, Jewish, are entitled to the law of return. And that is a very, very widespread understanding of the law of return. But that is actually not true, because as I showed you at the outset of this presentation, when the law of return was enacted, there was no definition of who is a Jew. What really forced the definition was this series of Supreme Court cases and political crises over cases involving intermarried couples and conversion, that really brought to the fore the necessity to really define who exactly is entitled to move to Israel under the law of return. And so this idea that the grandchildren of a Jew can make Aliyah, this is really a consequence of the 1970 amendment, right? This really did not exist in 1948. So what's really interesting is that this really gave rise to a dual definition of Jew in the state of Israel. So there's the definition of who is a Jew, and there's a definition of who is entitled to immigrate to Israel. And those are two definitions. So a Jew, according to really the legal definition based on halacha, and this was really a movement to please the Orthodox parties, which were part of Ben-Gurion's coalition, a Jew is someone who was born of a Jewish mother or converted to Judaism and is not a member of another religion. So here you hear a clear response to the Brother Daniel case. So it's not enough to be a Jew by birth or to have converted. You must not have adopted another religion. However, while it narrowed the definition, the legal definition of Jewish, the amendment to the law of return paradoxically also extended the rights of immigration, and it opened the doors to family members of Jews. So it noted that the rights of a Jew under this law are also vested in a child and a grandchild of a Jew, the spouse of a Jew, the spouse of a child of a Jew, and the spouse of a grandchild of a Jew. So really, it's quite a broad definition for the purpose of migrating to Israel. So really, from then on, you have two conflicting definitions of Jewish affiliation. One is religious and cultural, And the other one is one really a secular definition for the purpose of immigration. And it's tied to family ties and Jewish origin up to the third generation. And this really explains the subsequent plight of Jews who came from the former Soviet Union. As many of you might know, in the 1990s, there was a really large influx of Russians from the former Soviet Union. And they came thanks to this law because they had family ties to Judaism. But many of them were not halachically Jewish, right? And some of them actually observed Christianity. So they were able to move to Israel and become Israeli citizens, but they were not regarded as Jews. And so this has created ongoing tensions because this dual definition creates, a lot of gray areas. So, for instance, you have situations today where people who are part of this earlier influx of Soviet Jewry serve in the IDF. They are full-fledged citizens of the state of Israel. But if someone dies in the course of the war, and they're not halachically Jewish, they're not buried alongside other IDF soldiers because they cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery. So this dual definition has really created complications that are ongoing to this day. The other question deals with conversion, because the 1970 amendment did not mention what kind of conversions would be accepted for the purpose of making Aliyah, for the purpose of migrating to Israel. So it wasn't until 1986 that the courts decided that someone who converted either through the reform or the conservative movement would actually be entitled to move to Israel under the law of return. And those questions are unsettled. And really, this is probably one of the main points today, is that as we see, the legal and social developments in Israel, those questions are still very much fraught. And there are a number of Orthodox parties today who are trying to deny reform and conservative converts from the diaspora the ability to migrate to Israel under the law of return. So the law has not been changed as we speak, but there are ongoing tensions and pressure to change the law to really narrow the definition of who can actually make Aliyah to Israel. Okay, so in the second part of this talk, we'll spend less time on this, but it's really important to, I think, pause a little bit. I want to talk about the gap between formal citizenship and substantive citizenship. So this idea that on paper, you can be a citizen like anyone else, but in reality, in your social life, in your lived experiences, your treatment is different. There is a differentiated treatment. Your treatment is not the same as another citizen. So we spend a lot of time thinking about who is a Jew and what does it mean to return. But now I want to approach the question of what does it mean to return from the perspective of Mizrahi Jews, who were halachic Jews, and from that perspective did not have any trouble making Aliyah. But the troubles arose when they actually set foot on in the state of Israel itself, and they encountered a state that was governed by people who came from a very different culture. Ashkenazi Jews from Europe who had their own understanding of Jewish history, their own layers of trauma, and who saw these Mizrahi Jews as Jews by all intents and purposes, but Jews who in some ways were inferior to them. So here I brought you some pictures just to have a sense of what the ingathering of the exiles in kind of Zionist parlance would have meant in the wake of the foundation of the state. So here you have Iraqi Jews on the plane to Israel, arriving in Israel actually in 1951. Here are immigrants from Iraq and Kurdistan. And this, I think, is very much part of the Israeli imagination, right? Those really large influxes of Jews from all over the world, including Jews from the Middle East and Asia. And this, again, this was rooted in this sense that Jews had been homeless throughout their history, and they're returning home. And of course, the broader context for this was the context of decolonization. The reason why many Jews moved, especially from Arab lands, is for sure, some level of violence. And in fact, after the declaration of the State of Israel, there were riots across many Arab countries against Jews. And Jews were seen as, people who were potentially disloyal because there was a state in Israel. But that history forms part of the broader history of like European empires, and really the chaos of the post-World War II era, where there was increasing Arab nationalism, and the future of Jews throughout those various countries became increasingly uncertain. And so there's actually a lot of literature, of scholarly historical literature, on the motivations that really led Jews from the Middle East to migrate to Israel. And if not for really the chaos of the post-World War era and increasing tensions fomented by the rise of nationalism, they would not have imagined a future outside of their ancestral homelands of Iraq, Egypt, etc., if not for those post-World War II events. So I'm not going to get into many details, but all I'm trying to say is any historian who's looked at this really mass exodus from Arab lands shows that there were multiple factors that came into play for these individuals to decide to move. That's number one. Number two, what historians stress is that the story differed from place to place. So Jews in Morocco were in a very different situation from Jews in Iraq. We know about the Farhud in Iraq, this wave of riots and pogroms, some would say, against Iraqi Jews. Moroccan Jews did not face anything like this. And yet they migrated en masse to the State of Israel in the 1950s, right? So what they're saying is we really need to look at these communities case by case. And because of the discrimination that Jews from Arab lands faced in the hands of the Israeli state when they moved to Israel, that shared sense of having been discriminated against created a kind of a shared consciousness. And so that's really where the label Mizrahi Jew emerges, right? This idea that we have a shared destiny in the ways that we were treated by the state. The problem with the label Mizrahi Jews is it actually erases really many important differences between these different communities. Moroccan Jews, Algerian Jews, Iraqi Jews, Egyptian Jews, they all had very local histories rooted in a life that they had developed in those specific places across centuries. Okay, so here you have Yemenite Jews. So I want to spend 1 second talking about the Ma'abarat, which were those tents, really, those transit camps that were set up for recent immigrants coming to Israel in the 50s. And here, that's, I think, one area where you see the gap between the ways in which the State of Israel treated Ashkenazi immigrants and quote-unquote Mizrahi immigrants most visibly. Because Ashkenazi immigrants spent very little time in transit camps, whereas people who immigrated from Arab lands spent years in transit camps. They faced health issues, economic marginalization, social isolation, etc. So they weren't really able to participate in the state in the same ways than Ashkenazi immigrants were. And not only this, even after leaving transit camps, Sephardim, Mizrahim were moved in places in the outskirts of cities. I'm thinking about places like Beersheba, for instance, where they were really isolated from the mainstream Israeli population. And so that created really long-standing social issues and economic issues among Mizrahi Jews in Israel. And this is what really triggered the Israeli Black Panther movement in the 1970s, which was a movement of revolt by young Moroccan Jews particularly, but I think it was joined by other groups as well, to really denounce the plight of non-Ashkenazi Jews in the state of Israel and the ways in which they had been treated. So here, actually, it's really interesting. If anyone has access to the New York Times archives, you can actually find a number of articles that were published in the New York Times in the 1950s, documenting specifically the plight of Indian Jews. And Indian Jews are really interesting. They're not Arab Jews. There's a whole history about the Jews of India. Some of them were actually Baghdadi Jews from the Middle East, but I'm not going to get into the details. Indian Jews came to Israel in the 50s because of political uncertainty in the wake of decolonization, but also because they had a very strong sense of religious longing for the land of Israel. But they didn't come, unlike many other communities, they didn't come because of anti-Semitism. So they had the sense that their future was in Israel, but they had been treated really well throughout the course of Indian history. But when they came to Israel, they faced really intense discrimination and racism. They were called Black, and Black means that you were inferior to Ashkenazi Jews, and they were not able to really thrive economically. And what you must understand about the Bnei Israel community, this community in India particularly, is that many of them were very highly educated. They had been teachers in India. They had served in the British military. It was quite a learned population. And when they came to Israel, they were given really menial jobs. And so in 52, there was actually a very publicized protest through which Indian Jews denounced their treatment by the Israeli state and also asked for the Jewish agency to repatriate them to India, to the state of India. And so this is a part of an interview that was published in the New York Times that was documenting those protests. So Isaac Joseph, 32-year-old Bombay insurance salesman who acted as a spokesman for the group, said, "There was no pressure on us to leave in India. There was no discrimination against Jews in India. Many of us had good jobs. A great many were clerks, and there were a few carpenters, mechanics, and electricians. But we were fired with fanaticism. We had heard and read much about Israel. We were going to our own country, our own people." His face lit up with old enthusiasm for a moment. He then continued, "We are, but here we have learned that Easterners, and hence different and apparently inferior. In India, we were not different." Right. So here it's really interesting. It again complicates this notion of return, that for many people, the return to Israel was actually really a movement, a process through which they were uprooted from their own states from which they came and for their own culture. And I think it's in the case of Jews from the Middle East, it's particularly acute because, of course, Jews from the Middle East shared much cultural there was much cultural overlap between Jews from the Middle East and Arabs in Israel, right? They spoke a similar language. They had many cultural traditions. And because of the security situation, there was a lot of taboo around the Arab culture of Mizrahi Jews, and a lot of emphasis and a lot of pressure to really shed their unique culture rooted in the Arab Muslim world. And so that created a lot of cultural loss. So the return to Israel actually meant cultural dislocation for many of these individuals. Here I want to show you some photos from the Black Panther movements, which of course was modeled after the American Black Panthers. And here it raises interesting questions about Jewish history and African American history. We're not going to get into this, but it's an interesting intersection. Okay, we don't have much time left, so I'm not going to get into too many details, but I want to bring your attention to a professor of critical studies at NYU named Ella Shochat, who has spent really her entire career documenting and theorizing the plight of Mizrahi Jews in Israel and the ways in which the fate of Jews from Arab lands in Israel intersects with the plight of Palestinians. So this idea of this events of history that have dislocated these communities that historically shared a lot, but are now seen as very much opposed to one another. And this really theorizing is rooted in our own history, because Ella Shochat grew up in Israel to Iraqi parents. And she describes how her family, like many other Middle Eastern families, really had to completely dissociate themselves from their Middle Eastern roots. and that this really created a sense of cultural alienation in the state of Israel. So she's now lived in the U.S. for many years, actually. And what she describes, and here that's why I wanted to bring this particular excerpts, because she's also very much grappled with the notion of return. And she writes in a scholarly article that she published 20 years ago. Central to Zionist thinking was the concept of kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the exiles. Following 2 millennia of homelessness and living presumably outside of history, Jews could once again enter history as subjects, as normal actors on the world stage by returning to their ancient birthplace, Eretz Israel. And this idea of Jews entering history as normal subject is something I think that we've seen in the Brother Daniel case, in the opinions of both the justices. Though they had conflicting opinion on what should happen to Brother Daniel, I think they both articulated this notion that, Jews are now entering this stage of history as normal actors. But she writes, a corollary of the notion of Jewish return in Israel was the idea of rupture and discontinuity with diasporic existence. In order to be transformed into new Jews, later Israelis, the diasporic Jews had to abandon their diasporic culture, which in the case of Arab Jews meant abandoning Arabness and acquiescing in assimilationist modernization for their own good. And here that's where she ties together the plight of Arab Jews and Palestinians, what she calls Arab Jews. There's a lot of divisions among people of Middle Eastern Jewish descent about the term Arab Jews. So there are people like Ela Shochat who have made this term their own. They publicly identify as Arab Jews. And then there are other people of a similar background who actually take issues with this terminology. But it shows you here the importance of terms. And that's why I've been really, I've wanted to pause on the concept of return and the gathering of the exiles, because labels really help you articulate a narrative. And narratives matter because that's how you draw the borders of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And so what she's doing through this really articulation of Arab Jewish identity is really taking issue with the fundament, like the funding myth of the state of Israel. So she read the rescue narrative. So this idea that the state of Israel rescued quote unquote Arab Jews also elided Zionism's own role in provoking ruptures, dislocations, and fragmentation for Palestinian lives, and in a different way for Middle Eastern and North African Jews. And here, what's really interesting actually is that a lot of the people who really documented the situation of Middle Eastern Jews in Israel after the creation of the state are Iraqi Jews. And I think the reason for this is that a lot of Iraqi Jews were highly educated. And when they came to Israel, similar to the case of Indian Jews, they were shocked at the ways in which they were treated. Their skills were not recognized. They were not given jobs that matched their qualifications. And I think particularly in the Iraqi case, this created many layers of trauma. And I think that Iraqi Jews have been at the forefront of really talking about what happened to Middle Eastern Jews in Israel. And here I'm thinking about a writer called Avi Schleim, who's a historian, who's being very controversial because a lot of his depictions of what happened to Iraqi Jews is now being used to really denounce Zionism and attack kind of the idea of a state of Israel. But many of his ideas actually overlap with Ela Shochat, this idea of dislocation. Okay, we're going to skip this. So I wanted to actually show you 2 videos that show how the younger generation in Israel, who have ties to the Middle East, whose families came from the Middle East or the Arab world writ large, are really grappling with this. Because as Ela Shochatz alluded in her writings, a lot of Mizrahi culture in the early years of the state of Israel was suppressed, was taboo. What's interesting is that with the younger generation, a lot of young Israelis are coming back to these roots. And there are really many cases of young Israelis who did not grow up speaking Arabic. They might have heard it in their communities, but their language, their vernacular was Hebrew. But some of these singers and performers are singing in Arabic and really reclaiming their heritage. So again, continuing with this idea of return, I'm interested in this idea of cultural return into diasporic roots, especially roots in the Arab world. And so I'm going to show you two artists in particular. Um, One of them is Netal Kayam. You can see her here. She's of Moroccan descent, and she sings in Judeo-Arabic. And the other one is actually a band formed of three sisters who are of mixed Ashkenazi and Yemenite background. And they became really interested in what happened to their grandmother Rachel when Rachel moved to Israel from Yemen. And Rachel faced a lot of discrimination, a lot of difficulties. And so the three sisters, the band is named Ewa, sing in Yemenite Arabic. And a lot of their songs are really about what their grandmother went through. And similarly, Netal Kayam also talks a lot about her grandmother. So we don't have time to expand on this here, but there's also, of course, a gendered dimension to return. How do men and women experience return, or the notion of return and home and belonging differently? I'm leaving it out there. We don't have time to expand, but it's interesting that these artists overlap also in this theme. Okay, so I'm gonna play this for a few minutes. I'm gonna stop here. Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay, so this brings me to really my concluding thoughts, if one can really conclude, which I feel like we can't because it's an ongoing story. But I think what the story of the first decades and really to this day of the state of Israel, and this is, I think, a story that goes beyond the particulars of the state of Israel itself. This history reminds us that citizenship, nationality, and belonging are not fixed categories, but they're constantly negotiated through law, as we've seen in the earlier part of the presentation, politics, memory, and narrative. I think here, through those videos, you really see the importance of narrative. What does it mean for those young Israeli artists to really redefine their belonging in the state of Israel as Arabic speaker? And here it's also very political. Some of you might know about the nation state law that was enacted in Israel in the 2018 that pretty much completely silenced the rights of non-Jews in the state of Israel, right? I think we see it with figures like Ben Gvir today, and this is obviously very controversial in Israel, but there's like a trend towards ethno-nationalism that is giving less and less room for the rights of non-Jews. And it's also, it's not just non-Jews, because Jews themselves are also, I think, their rights are being shrunk by this kind of really increasingly inclusive, or exclusive rather, definition of who counts as a Jew and who can live in Israel and have the full rights of citizen. I think part of the growing discontent or rift between American Jewry and the state of Israel has to do with this, because I think I mentioned it last time, Jews in America have a very different understanding of what it means to be a Jew. And when they see political parties in Israel who are trying to attempt to limit the rights of converts from the Reform and Conservative movement, they're very alarmed about what that means about not only the treatment of non-Jews within the borders of Israel, but also Jews in the diaspora. So I don't want to get too political, but all I'm saying is those questions and tensions are very much ongoing, but they show you the value of kind of going back to earlier narratives that show really the plurality of Jewish identities prior to the founding of the state of Israel. What does it mean to revisit diasporic histories within Israel itself? And so what the Israeli case shows you, and again, this is something that we can think of in other countries as well, is really how the boundaries of the nation are never fully settled. They're sustained, they're contested, and they're revised through the stories that communities tell about their past and the future that they hope to build. And you see this through this artist. So this is really where I think learning history matters. And that's where I hope that what I've shared with you in the previous sessions and today really helps you maybe broaden your understanding of history and gives you the tools to invent new narratives about what Jewish life might look like in the future. So the questions that are raised by the debates we saw today remain with us. Who belongs? Who decides? Where is home? And can any political community ever fully resolve the tension between the universal promise of inclusion, which was very much the promise of the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, and the inevitable limits of belonging. So we see that the story of return is not a story with an ending, but it's an ongoing argument about the relationship between the past, the present, and the future, and who gets to be a part of this story. I'm going to end here for all of us to grapple with these questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gudefin, for another really wonderful presentation. And for those of you with questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. To get us started, a question here. It seems that each example you gave in the last half hour about return was a problem, or they had issues. Are you able to share one or two positive examples?
I mean, I think there are many examples. I mean, including, I'm not arguing that for people in Israel, like their identity is like, this notion of complete dislocation and that they don't belong. I think even people who, criticize the state of Israel or the past treatment of Mizrahi Jews or Arab Jews or Palestinians, many of them feel a very strong sense of belonging, right? So I think those things can coexist. I Despite also the rift that I mentioned, I think Jews across the diaspora feel a very strong connection to Israel. And despite the geopolitical issues, many people feel like their future might reside in the state of Israel, and that the state of Israel as an idea, this idea of a safe place for Jews, again, despite the geopolitical complications, still very much appeals to them and means something to them. I'm also thinking about, like, maybe I actually almost included something on him. There's this influencer. I don't know how much all of you follow social media, but this really interesting young man. He must be in his mid-30s. His name, I think, his name is Noor Yassin, if I'm not mistaken. But his influencer name is Nas Daily, and he is an Arab Israeli Muslim. He grew up in Israel, but in an Arab Muslim family. And he describes how growing up, he actually was quite isolated from mainstream Jewish society. But he posts like almost daily, and some of his videos are about his own sense of identity and belonging. And he describes how after October 7th, he really realized that, despite all the complex realities of living in Israel as an Arab Muslim, his home is Israel. And that he shares this fate with, the vast majority of Israelis who are Jews. And that's who he is. That's his country. And he actually, maybe 1 or 2 years ago, he made a short video called "Let Me Show You My Home," where he goes to Israel and, shows where he's from and shows that this is where he belongs. And he got a lot of pushback, by people who are anti-Zionist, and it was very, very controversial. But I think it shows you that we can both acknowledge the complexities and, the competing definitions and understandings of home and return and belonging, while also looking at, positive stories of people actually still making a society out of, those complex histories. So I think there's a lot of positive stories. I don't know if that answers it, but I didn't mean to be overly negative. I just think that the negative stories help you really think through what it means to draw the boundaries of belonging. That's, again, I didn't mean to be negative. It really is just, that's where in the tensions, you really see the complex process through which states, communities, individuals decides who's in and who's out. That's why I love legal history. That's why I study legal history, because, as we say, what we see in the legal cases, it's outliers. Most normal life does not involve, disputes and legal cases. The legal cases are very much what's actually at the periphery of, normal society. But these tensions show you, they bring to the fore what is left unspoken, what is left unsaid, and how do we actually create belonging. So that's that's why I thought those examples were quite significant in that sense. And
Thank you.
the the music itself is a positive. I think the ways in which those artists took their family's trauma and turned this into what I think is remarkable art. I love these artists, and they are bringing people together. Ewa, Netal Kayam, their songs are listened to throughout Arabic speaking countries. Netel Kayam, she goes back to Morocco, and Moroccan Muslims sing along. They love their art. They love her art. They treat her as a returnee to Morocco when she gives concerts. So you can see how they've really turned this dislocation and trauma into something positive that is bringing people together across ethnic, religious, and national differences.
Thank you. That's really wonderful to hear and beautifully put. Um, as a follow-up, I just received one, if you want to say more about the tragedy of October 7th and whether that helped heal some of the negativity among different Jewish nationalities in Israel. And if you want to speak beyond that.
Um, I don't exactly know about like the ethnic element of it. I'm afraid to say that I'm not sure that October 7th has really healed the various rifts within Israeli society. I think politically it's a very divided society. Um, I think there's, I did want to mention, the lack of separation between religion and state of Israel and ongoing issues around that, because I think this is something that is very tense. I think the Orthodox monopoly on the rabbinate is something that creates a lot of resentment. So I don't think that nowadays the main tension is really surrounding ethnic differences. Also, now Mizrahi Jews are half of the Israeli, more than half. I mean, most Israeli Jews today have, Mizrahi ancestry, and also, many decades into the foundation of the state, many Israelis are themselves of mixed, like descent, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, or other. So I don't really think that's really the main factor of division, but I think there are other factor of divisions that shows you that show you that I guess the question of who belongs and who doesn't is still very fraught and unsettled, and I think that has a lot to do with tensions around religion and the demographic crisis. I think the sense that Haredim are going to have an increasing amount of power as they become potentially someday the majority demographically. So I think there are a lot of uncertainty among secular Jews around those questions. And talking about the notion of return, and that complicates the story even further. I know a lot of people who have successfully attempted to get European passports. So you might have heard about the Iberian or the Sephardic laws of return that allowed people who could show that they were descendants of Portuguese or Spanish Jews who had been expelled from Iberia, the opportunity to get a Portuguese or Spanish passport. Now, those routes are kind of closed. It's very hard to do nowadays, but for about 10 years, thousands of people applied and many of them got those passports. People are also trying to get, German or Polish citizenship if their families were victims during the Holocaust. So you see how those issues still play out. The question of citizenship and attempting to have multiple passports and citizenships, not necessarily because they don't see their future in Israel, but there is a sense, I think increasingly in Israel, that people need a plan B, and that nothing is set in stone, but that having some sort of paper that allows you to live somewhere else if needed is something that's very valuable. So that also, I think, complicates the story. Like the story of Israelis living in Berlin, for instance. Germany has one of the largest Israeli communities in Europe today, if not the largest. So all of this to say is that the state of Israel is obviously a remarkable event, but that it's a complicated story that is ongoing, and what's going to happen in the future is no one knows.
Thank you. And a final question here, which I'll say before, but we can also include notes about it in our follow-up email. But somebody asked if you can recommend some good books on the impact of decolonialization on Jews of Arab
Mm.
and other countries, or if there's anything you would like to say about that now.
There's so much to say. I would be so happy to send some references. Um, I think what ties it to my lecture is a sense of rupture. I think one thing I want, two words I didn't mention, but I think that it's part of the story is the notion of an impossible return. You know, the geopolitical developments since the 40s and after World War II are of such scope that return to what was before is impossible, right? Jews are not going to go back to Iraq today. First, they cannot legally, but they wouldn't want to. And you know, the Iraqi diaspora is so fascinating. And I'm living in Singapore now, where the people who really set up the community in Singapore in the 19th century were originally from Iraq and Syria. And to this day, they observe Iraqi customs, you know, food. Like in Israel, there are a lot of descendants of Iraqi Jews who are, you know, publishing cookbook of Iraqi food, are talking about Iraqi music. They really are reclaiming this heritage, but they cannot go back to Iraq, and they don't want to go back to Iraq. So I think we just must acknowledge that the rupture is something that we must live with, and in that sense, it's not just a Jewish story. And that's why I think decolonization is important. Because think about India and Pakistan. You know, there's a lot of talk about Israel-Palestine, but at the very same time when those events occurred, when the rupture had, when Palestinian displacement occurred, um, you had the dramatic events and the partition of India and Pakistan. Millions of people died. Forced migration. You know, Muslims were forced to go to Pakistan. Hindu we had to move places that they had lived in for centuries and went to the state of India. The trauma of those events are huge. And it's, you know, a very similar story. It's part of the story of British colonialism and decolonization. And so I think when we think about what happened to Jews in Arab countries, we also have to widen the frame and think more globally about the history of empires and the ruptures wrought by decolonization. And they are really great scholars who have done that job of bringing those stories together instead of seeing them as like isolated instances. And so there's also some literature that I would be happy to share.
Certainly.
Is that clear? Sorry, that's a lot, but I hope
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that's yeah, totally. Like, yeah, the ideas you presented are very, very clear. And so, with that, you know, we a couple minutes left. Is there any final thoughts you want to reiterate or leave us with as we conclude this series?
Uh, just to thank you. It was really a journey, I think, to prepare those 4 sessions, and I brought you to many different places geographically and chronologically. So I hope I didn't lose you across those 4 sessions. And I just want to thank all of you for joining and for your really excellent questions. I always write them down and I grapple with them after the talks. So thank you for your engagement, really.